Think you know medieval history? Think again. We're diving deep into the untold stories of queens who weren't just consorts, but strategic masterminds, political powerhouses, and the true forces behind some of history's most pivotal moments. Get ready to discover the real architects of royal destinies. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, where history speaks beyond the textbooks. In this video, we will uncover the hidden influence of queens who shaped empires, defied convention, and changed the course of nations. For centuries, the image of monarchy has been shaped around kings, warriors, and rulers whose power seemed absolute. The stories told in chronicles, the portraits painted in courts, and the lessons passed through generations often placed the king at the heart of authority. Yet behind almost every king stood a queen whose role has too often been reduced to that of a wife, mother, or ornamental presence. This portrayal hides a more complex reality. Queens were not silent figures trapped in domestic roles. Many were active participants in governance, diplomacy, religion, and even warfare. Their influence was sometimes open, sometimes hidden, but always significant. To understand history fully, one must look beyond the king's shadow and acknowledge the queens who shaped the fate of nations. During the medieval period, power in Europe was tied to lineage, marriage, and the church. A queen's marriage was not a romantic arrangement, but a political alliance that bound kingdoms, secured borders, and ensured heirs. The queen's body became a symbol of continuity, but her mind and voice could determine political survival. Empress Matilda, the daughter of King Henry I of England, is one of the clearest examples of a woman who refused to accept a passive role. When her father died without a male heir, Matilda was named his successor. Yet upon his death, her cousin Stephen seized the throne. What followed was a brutal civil conflict known as the Anarchy, lasting nearly 2 decades. Matilda's leadership was extraordinary for her time. She raised armies, held her own in negotiations with barons, and fought fiercely to claim the crown she believed was hers by right. Although she never formally ruled as queen, her persistence laid the groundwork for her son Henry II's accession, ensuring the continuation of the Plantagenet line. Her influence shaped English governance for generations. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Matilda's daughter-in-law, pushed the boundaries of queenship even further. She was one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe, ruling over vast territories in southwestern France long before her marriages to Louis VII of France and later Henry II of England. Eleanor was no passive consort. As Queen of France, she accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, demonstrating both courage and leadership in a setting dominated by men. Though the crusade itself failed, Eleanor's presence left an impression on contemporaries and chroniclers who were astonished by her independence. After her marriage to Henry II, she became Queen of England and mother to 10 children, including Richard the Lionheart and King John. Yet she did not remain in the background. When Henry's rule became oppressive, Eleanor supported her sons in rebellion against their father, showing political acumen and defiance uncommon for women of her rank. Later, during Richard's absence on crusade, she served as regent, governing England with skill and authority. Her letters, orders, and diplomatic correspondence show a queen who understood not just the mechanics of rule, but the deeper art of power. Moving from the 12th to the 13th century, queens like Blanche of Castile continued this pattern of active governance. As the wife of Louis VIII and the mother of Louis IX of France, Blanche became regent during her son's minority. She managed internal revolts, balanced relations with powerful nobles, and preserved royal authority during one of the most fragile periods in French history. Chroniclers noted her intelligence, dignity, and strength, though some male writers portrayed her firmness as unnatural for a woman. Blanche, however, was essential in maintaining the monarchy's stability, proving that queens could wield power effectively without undermining the ideals of female virtue promoted by the church. Her regency demonstrated that political authority could be shared, not monopolized by kings. In England, a similar story unfolded with Eleanor of Provence, wife of Henry III. Though she did not lead armies like Eleanor of Aquitaine, she played a central role in managing court politics and patronage. Her influence was visible in the appointments she supported, the cultural exchanges she encouraged, and the diplomatic work she undertook on behalf of her husband. Queenship in this period was not defined only by open acts of rule, but also by subtle negotiations, alliances, and interventions that shaped the decisions of kings and councils. The queen's presence at court was both symbolic and practical, serving as a bridge between the crown and its subjects. As Europe entered the later Middle Ages, the image of the queen continued to evolve. Isabella of France, the wife of Edward II of England, transformed from consort to political actor in dramatic fashion. Married to a weak and unpopular king, Isabella initially fulfilled her role as peacemaker and mother. Yet as Edward's rule descended into chaos, largely due to his dependence on favorites like Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, Isabella's patience ended. She left England for France, gathered support from exiled nobles, and returned with an army to depose her husband. The coup was swift and successful. Though she ruled briefly as regent for her son, Edward III, her partnership with Roger Mortimer and her reputation for ambition ultimately led to her downfall. Still, Isabella's story reveals the potential and the peril of female power in a patriarchal system. She acted when male authority failed, demonstrating that queens could shape the course of history even through rebellion. Elsewhere in Europe, Margaret of Denmark and Margaret of Anjou displayed similar determination. Margaret of Denmark, known as the Semiramis of the North, united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under her rule in the late 14th century, creating the Kalmar Union. Her leadership was pragmatic and strategic, focused on maintaining unity among diverse kingdoms. She ruled not as a puppet of men, but as a capable monarch in her own right, establishing precedents for female sovereignty in Scandinavia. Margaret of Anjou, the wife of Henry VI of England, inherited a realm weakened by her husband's mental illness and political indecision. She became the driving force behind the Lancastrian cause during the Wars of the Roses, commanding armies, negotiating alliances, and defying expectations of female behavior. Though ultimately defeated, her courage and ambition earned her both admiration and condemnation. She embodied the queen as warrior and protector of dynasty, a figure as fierce as any male ruler. The Renaissance and early modern eras brought new ideas about monarchy, but queens continued to exercise power in ways both visible and concealed. Catherine de' Medici, the Italian-born Queen of France, stands as a striking example. Married to Henry II and mother to three kings, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, Catherine's political influence spanned decades. Her regencies and her role during the French Wars of Religion reveal a woman navigating the complexities of faith, faction, and survival. While later historians often painted her as a scheming manipulator, more recent scholarship recognizes her as a pragmatic stateswoman striving to maintain stability in a divided kingdom. She used marriage diplomacy, court ceremony, and religious moderation to preserve royal authority. Her actions, though controversial, demonstrate the burdens queens faced when ruling amid crisis. In England, the Tudor dynasty produced two of history's most famous queens, Mary I and Elizabeth I. Mary's reign was short and troubled, marked by her attempt to restore Catholicism after her father Henry VIII's break with Rome. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was intended to strengthen her position, but it instead fueled fears of foreign domination. Despite her failures, Mary's determination to govern as a legitimate monarch rather than a consort broke important ground for women in power. Her half-sister Elizabeth took those lessons and transformed them into an enduring legacy. Elizabeth I ruled alone, refusing marriage to preserve her autonomy and declaring herself married to her kingdom. Her reign combined intelligence, theatricality, and political skill. She balanced competing religious factions, fostered exploration, and navigated the dangers of male-dominated politics with grace and authority. Her image as the Virgin Queen was not a mark of purity alone, but a calculated assertion of independence. Elizabeth showed that queenship could be both feminine and sovereign, that authority need not depend on a husband or king. Beyond England and France, queens in other parts of Europe also stepped beyond traditional boundaries. Isabella of Castile, who ruled jointly with her husband Ferdinand of Aragon, transformed Spain through her reforms, conquests, and religious policies. Together they completed the Reconquista, uniting their kingdoms and laying the foundations for modern Spain. Yet Isabella's role was far from secondary. She was an administrator, strategist, and devout believer whose decisions shaped not only Spain's internal structure, but also its global expansion. Her support for Christopher Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic initiated an era of exploration that changed world history. Though her legacy is complex, particularly because of the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain, Isabella's reign demonstrated the vast potential of female leadership. Across the English Channel, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, became a tragic figure in the struggle between personal identity and political reality. Crowned as an infant, raised in France, and returning to rule a divided Scotland, Mary faced constant challenges. Her marriages, especially to Henry Darnley and later the Earl of Bothwell, brought scandal and rebellion. Yet even in captivity, Mary remained a political force. Her claim to the English throne made her both a threat and a victim in Elizabeth's eyes. Her execution, ordered by Elizabeth in the name of national security, marked the end of her ambitions, but ensured her place in history as a queen whose life embodied the dangers of female sovereignty in a male-dominated world. In later centuries, queens continued to wield influence in changing ways. Anne of Austria, the mother of Louis XIV, served as regent of France during his minority. Working with Cardinal Mazarin, she navigated civil wars known as the Fronde and preserved the monarchy's authority. Her patience and intelligence allowed her son to assume the throne with absolute power, shaping the image of kingship in France for generations. Similarly, in England, Queen Anne presided over the unification of England and Scotland into Great Britain in the early 18th century. Though often overshadowed by her ministers, she was deeply involved in political decisions, particularly concerning religion and succession. Her reign marked the transition toward constitutional monarchy, where royal power was balanced by parliamentary authority. Catherine the Great of Russia provides perhaps the clearest example of a queen, or rather an empress, who not only stepped beyond the king's shadow but completely redefined imperial rule. Born a minor German princess, she married the future Peter III of Russia. When Peter proved unfit to rule, Catherine seized power in a coup supported by the army and nobility. Her reign transformed Russia into a major European power. She promoted education, reformed administration, corresponded with Enlightenment thinkers, and expanded her empire through conquest. Though her rule was autocratic, her vision for modernization reflected the ideals of her age. Catherine's story shows how female rulers could not only survive in patriarchal systems, but thrive within them, using intelligence, charm, and decisiveness to command respect. Even in the modern period, queens have balanced symbolic and practical authority. Queen Victoria of Britain reigned for more than 60 years, overseeing a vast empire and serving as a figure of stability in an age of industrial and political change. While she did not rule in the same direct way as her medieval predecessors, her moral influence shaped the values of her era. She corresponded with ministers, influenced appointments, and maintained a strong sense of duty that reinforced the monarchy's relevance. Her example, followed later by queens such as Elizabeth II, demonstrated that female monarchy could evolve with time, adapting to constitutional limits while preserving a sense of continuity. Looking across these centuries, a clear pattern emerges. The queens who defined history were not passive ornaments of the court, but active agents of power. Their influence took many forms: Matilda's military resistance, Eleanor's diplomacy, Blanche's regency, Isabella's rebellion, Margaret's union-building, Catherine de' Medici's political balancing, Elizabeth's solitary rule, and Catherine the Great's imperial ambition. Each faced the constraints of gender and expectation, yet each found ways to assert control. They understood the tools available to them: marriage, motherhood, religion, and representation, and used them to shape policy and perception alike. Even when chroniclers dismissed their actions as unnatural, these women proved that queenship was not merely a reflection of kingship, but a distinct form of power. The misconception that queens were confined to domesticity arises partly from the nature of historical record-keeping. Chroniclers, usually men, often judged female authority through moral rather than political lenses. A queen who acted decisively risked being labeled proud, manipulative, or unfeminine. Those who succeeded were praised for virtues of obedience and chastity rather than leadership. Yet when one examines letters, charters, and diplomatic correspondence, a different image emerges. Queens were central to networks of power, mediating between the king and the court, the church and the people. They granted patronage, interceded for subjects, and served as symbols of mercy in contrast to the king's justice. Their influence was often indirect, but no less real. Even the domestic sphere, where queens were supposedly confined, became a space of power. Managing the royal household was a major administrative task, involving vast expenditures, personnel, and protocol. Through their control of patronage, queens could reward loyalty, build alliances, and shape cultural life. Eleanor of Aquitaine's court at Poitiers became a center of art and poetry, while Catherine de' Medici used court festivals and architecture to project royal grandeur. Queens also played vital roles in religion, founding convents, supporting monasteries, and influencing ecclesiastical appointments. Their piety was not only spiritual but political, reinforcing legitimacy and guiding the moral tone of the court. The enduring fascination with queens arises because they operated at the intersection of public and private life. They were wives and mothers, but also rulers and strategists. Their power was constrained, yet their actions often altered the course of nations. Their stories reveal that monarchy was never solely about male authority. It was a partnership, sometimes harmonious, often contentious, between kings and queens who each embodied different aspects of rule. In this light, the history of queenship becomes a story of negotiation, between expectation and ambition, love and politics, visibility and secrecy. When we look beyond the king's shadow, we find a world of female agency that challenges the idea of passivity. These queens were diplomats, commanders, legislators, and visionaries. Their achievements were sometimes hidden by prejudice, yet they endure in the structures they built and the legacies they left. The castles they fortified, the alliances they forged, and the dynasties they preserved stand as monuments to their strength. Whether leading armies, ruling in regency, or shaping policy from behind the throne, they proved that authority could wear a crown and still be called queen. The prevailing historical narrative may have long sidelined them, but history itself cannot erase their power. Through their courage and intellect, they stood not in a king's shadow but in the full light of their own making. The influence of queens has often been disguised beneath layers of tradition and male-centered narratives. For much of recorded history, the lens through which power was viewed rested firmly on the figure of the king, his victories, his decrees, his legacy. Yet when one looks closer, beneath the surface of royal chronologies, one finds that the machinery of governance, diplomacy, and stability often depended upon the wisdom, calculation, and endurance of queens. They were the political heartbeats of courts that credited their kings for triumphs these women had helped secure. The idea that queens were secondary to their husbands or fathers is a distortion that hides their true impact. They were not ornaments but architects of power, not spectators but strategists. Their strength did not always manifest in open battle or formal decrees, but in the subtle and steady shaping of events that determined the course of kingdoms. Among these remarkable women, Eleanor of Aquitaine stands as a symbol of both intelligence and defiance. She inherited vast lands in what is now southwestern France, making her one of the most sought-after heiresses in Europe. Her first marriage, to Louis VII of France, united two great powers but also revealed the limits of medieval expectations for women. Eleanor was educated, articulate, and politically aware, while Louis, though pious, was indecisive and cautious. The Second Crusade offered Eleanor her first taste of public leadership. She traveled with her husband to the east, surrounded by her own retinue of vassals, and was not content to be a silent observer. She participated in councils, advised military strategies, and managed resources. Chroniclers, uncomfortable with a woman's visible role in warfare and politics, accused her of arrogance and scandal. Yet behind those accusations lies acknowledgement of her authority. When her marriage to Louis was annulled, she acted swiftly to secure her future, marrying Henry of Anjou, who would soon become Henry II of England. This union changed the map of Europe, creating a vast empire stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. As Queen of England, Eleanor was far more than Henry's consort. She managed her lands independently, administered justice, and maintained correspondence with rulers and nobles across Europe. Her court became a center of culture, poetry, and political thought. Yet her independence bred tension. When Henry's authoritarian style led to conflict within the royal family, Eleanor supported her sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, in rebellion. It was a bold and dangerous move that resulted in her imprisonment for years. But Eleanor's story did not end in captivity. After Henry's death, she was released and became the pillar of stability for her son, King Richard the Lionheart. While Richard fought abroad on crusade, she ruled as regent, collected ransom for his release, and maintained peace in the realm. Even in her later years, she traveled extensively to secure alliances and manage dynastic matters. Her letters and decisions display a woman who understood politics not as a distant game, but as a living practice shaped by negotiation, persuasion, and endurance. Eleanor's legacy endured through her children and grandchildren, many of whom inherited her sharp mind and political instinct. She embodied the idea that a queen could be both mother and monarch, both nurturer and negotiator. Long before Eleanor, another woman had challenged the limits of royal authority and redefined what it meant to rule as a woman. Empress Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England, grew up in a court that valued education and governance. Her father had lost his only legitimate son in a shipwreck, leaving Matilda as his sole heir. He compelled his barons to swear loyalty to her, but upon his death, that oath proved fragile. Her cousin Stephen seized the crown, sparking nearly 2 decades of civil war known as the Anarchy. Matilda's determination to reclaim her birthright was extraordinary in a world that doubted female leadership. She raised armies, gathered loyal supporters, and fought a relentless campaign to assert her claim. Her courage was undeniable. In one famous escape from Oxford Castle, she fled across frozen ground in the snow, cloaked in white to avoid capture. Matilda's rule was brief and troubled, but her influence extended far beyond the battlefield. She introduced a new model of queenship grounded in legitimacy, intelligence, and the exercise of authority through law and governance. She did not seek to rule through her husband or son, but in her own right as a rightful sovereign. Although the nobility resisted the notion of a reigning woman, her persistence ensured that her son, Henry II, would inherit the throne she fought for. In doing so, she established the Plantagenet dynasty that would dominate England for centuries. Her life teaches that power, when denied by convention, can still be asserted through will and intellect. Matilda's correspondence and administrative reforms demonstrate her practical understanding of rule. She issued charters, negotiated with bishops, and maintained her claim through diplomacy as much as through force. Even when circumstances pushed her from the throne, she never relinquished the idea that a woman could govern with the same authority as a man. Her story became a precedent for later queens who would navigate the same blend of resistance and necessity. A generation later, Blanche of Castile would take up that mantle in France and prove that a queen could govern not by rebellion, but by reason and resolve. The daughter of Alfonso of Castile and granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Blanche inherited both political intelligence and a deep sense of royal responsibility. Married to Louis VIII of France, she became queen consort and mother to Louis IX, who would later be canonized as Saint Louis. When her husband died prematurely, Blanche was left as regent for her 12-year-old son. The kingdom she inherited was fragile. Powerful nobles challenged her authority, England threatened the borders, and internal unrest brewed across provinces. Blanche responded with firmness and clarity. She summoned councils, secured alliances, and personally led negotiations with rebels. Chroniclers noted her calm, yet commanding presence. She wore armor when necessary, led armies when diplomacy failed, and governed with discipline and justice. Her regency was not merely a period of survival, but one of consolidation. She strengthened royal authority, reformed administration, and ensured that her son would inherit a stable kingdom. Even after Louis reached adulthood, she remained his closest advisor, often mediating between him and the papacy or between rival factions at court. Blanche's letters reveal her sharp intellect and moral conviction. She believed that power required both mercy and strength, and her guidance shaped Louis's pious and just approach to kingship. Unlike many regents who lost influence once their sons matured, Blanche maintained respect and authority until her death. Her reign proved that a queen could be both guardian and governor, that female rule could stabilize rather than disrupt the state. These 3 women, Eleanor, Matilda, and Blanche, illustrate the evolution of queenship as a dynamic form of power. Each faced distinct challenges. Matilda confronted a society unwilling to accept female sovereignty. Eleanor balanced love, ambition, and political survival across 2 kingdoms. Blanche navigated regency amid war and rebellion. Yet all 3 shared a common trait. They understood the machinery of power better than many of the men who opposed them. Their success lay not only in their actions, but in their ability to command loyalty, project authority, and preserve legitimacy in hostile environments. They mastered the delicate art of influence, operating both within and beyond the structures of male rule. The medieval world offered few paths for women to wield power openly, yet these queens found ways to assert control through law, diplomacy, and lineage. They were skilled communicators, often using their correspondence as political tools. Their letters were more than personal exchanges. They were instruments of persuasion and command. They cultivated networks of nobles, clerics, and advisors who advanced their agendas. They used religious patronage to enhance their reputations and to link their authority to divine favor. They also understood the symbolic importance of the royal body, the image of the queen as mother and protector. This dual identity allowed them to justify their actions in terms society could accept, even as they pushed against its boundaries. Eleanor, Matilda, and Blanche were not isolated exceptions. They were part of a broader pattern in which queens across Europe adapted to the structures of their age while subtly reshaping them. In England, later queens like Isabella of France and Margaret of Anjou continued this legacy, proving that women could influence succession, diplomacy, and war. Isabella's rebellion against Edward II, though controversial, demonstrated her political acumen and courage. Margaret's leadership during the Wars of the Roses showed a similar determination to preserve her family's crown. In France, queens such as Catherine de' Medici would later employ strategies rooted in the example of Blanche of Castile, balancing factions, using religion as a tool of unity, and maintaining stability amid chaos. These later figures owed something, even if indirectly, to the foundations laid by their predecessors. The idea of the queen as a political mastermind challenges the simplistic image of royal women as passive symbols. Their authority was often unofficial, exercised through counsel rather than command, yet it could shape outcomes just as decisively. A queen's influence rested on trust, perception, and the ability to interpret the shifting moods of the court. While kings often relied on military power or divine right, queens depended on strategy, persuasion, and alliance building. They were, in many ways, the architects of soft power before the term existed. Their understanding of the human element of rule, the emotions, loyalties, and ambitions that governed men, allowed them to act with precision where force might fail. In studying these women, it becomes clear that queenship was not a uniform role, but a flexible institution shaped by circumstance. Matilda's authority came from birthright, Eleanor's from land and personality, Blanche's from regency and moral force. Yet all were united by a shared belief that their intelligence and will could define history. Their lives reveal a pattern of adaptation. When denied a throne, they built influence through family. When denied the sword, they used diplomacy. When confined to the court, they transformed it into a center of governance. The myth that queens merely occupied the background collapses when confronted with the evidence of their deeds. Beyond individual actions, their influence changed perceptions of monarchy itself. They demonstrated that leadership required not only strength but vision, not only legitimacy but wisdom. Their sons and successors inherited kingdoms, shaped by their mother's decisions. Henry II's administrative reforms, Richard the Lionheart's diplomatic confidence, and Louis IX's just governance all bear traces of maternal guidance. The queens who nurtured them were also their tutors in statecraft. Their power may have been described as indirect, but its results were permanent. The lasting lesson from these reigns is that queenship offered a different but equally potent form of rule. A king might conquer a land, but a queen could secure it. A king could command loyalty, but a queen could sustain it. Their power lay in continuity, in maintaining the delicate web of relations that kept kingdoms stable. Through their patience and prudence, they turned survival into strategy. Their actions remind us that history is not only written by those who fight battles, but also by those who prevent them, who negotiate peace, and who preserve order when chaos looms. The political mastery of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Empress Matilda, and Blanche of Castile reveals that queenship was as complex as kingship, perhaps more so. They had to navigate prejudice, constraint, and suspicion while exercising authority in forms society found acceptable. They learned to use their supposed weakness as strength, turning their roles as mothers and wives into sources of legitimacy. Their reigns illustrate that power is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it works quietly, guiding decisions and shaping outcomes without claiming credit. Their influence endures not only in chronicles, but in the evolution of monarchy itself. The balance between the public and private, the symbolic and the practical, the visible and the unseen, all these aspects of governance that later rulers mastered were pioneered by queens who had no choice but to innovate. To look beyond the king's shadow, then, is to rediscover the foundation upon which royal authority rested. It is to see that the stability of nations often depended on the wisdom of queens who understood that power, to be effective, must adapt to circumstance. Eleanor, Matilda, and Blanche were not anomalies, but reflections of a broader truth. That leadership has many faces, and that those who appear secondary can often be the true sources of strength. Their stories remind us that history, like the courts they ruled, is built on partnership. Kings may have worn the crown, but queens ensured it did not fall. The story of queenship does not end with acts of governance, regency, or diplomacy. Beyond battlefields and court intrigues, another, quieter form of influence defined the legacy of these royal women, the power to shape memory itself. If politics determined the course of events, history determined how those events would be remembered. In an age when few could read and fewer still could write, the written word was both weapon and monument. The chroniclers of medieval Europe did more than record facts. They crafted the image of power. They told stories that would define the reputations of rulers long after their deaths. Queens, often denied the sword or the seal, learned to wield the pen through others. By funding monasteries, commissioning histories, and guiding narratives, they ensured that their voices would echo across generations, even when silenced in life. This act of shaping history began in the monasteries, where the work of writing was a sacred duty. Scribes copied not only scripture but also annals, biographies, and official records. Yet writing required resources, ink, parchment, labor, and above all, patronage. Queens recognized this and turned the sponsorship of scribes into a form of power. Their donations to monastic communities were acts of piety, but also of strategy. A monastery that received royal favor was expected to record events favorably, to emphasize divine sanction, or to highlight certain virtues in its patrons. Queens who funded these institutions did more than support religion. They invested in the future of their reputations. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance, understood the relationship between image and authority better than most of her contemporaries. During her lifetime, she was alternately admired and condemned. Chroniclers hostile to her independence painted her as ambitious, even immoral. Yet Eleanor countered these narratives by supporting artistic and literary production at her court. The poets and troubadours of Aquitaine and Poitiers did not write chronicles in the monastic sense, but their works celebrated ideals of love, virtue, and loyalty that mirrored Eleanor's own sense of identity. Through culture, she reshaped how power could appear feminine without being weak. Later chroniclers, working under her descendants, softened the portrayal of her rebellion and emphasized her wisdom as a stateswoman. Such revisions did not occur by accident. They were guided by the political needs of her lineage, which owed much to the patronage she established. Blanche of Castile, another queen who grasped the connection between narrative and legitimacy, also invested in the written word. Her regency for her son, Louis IX, depended on maintaining the moral and divine image of the Capetian dynasty. She funded religious houses and scriptoria that recorded not only the acts of kings, but the piety of the royal family. Chroniclers such as William of Nantes presented Blanche as a model of Christian queenship, wise and devoted, ruling with faith and restraint. These portrayals, preserved through manuscripts produced under her patronage, helped to sanctify her son's image and secure her own. When Louis was later canonized, Blanche's reputation as the devout mother of a saintly king became part of the narrative of divine order in France. Her careful management of written memory ensured that her political actions, some harsh, some pragmatic, were interpreted through a moral lens. In England, the shaping of royal history through female influence can be seen as early as the time of Empress Matilda. Though Matilda herself lived in an age of open conflict and may not have commissioned chronicles directly during her struggle, her supporters recognized the importance of controlling the story. The Gesta Stephanie, written during the Civil War, portrayed her rival King Stephen as lawful and pious while presenting Matilda as proud and masculine. Yet later writers, working under the reign of her son Henry II, reversed that image. Chronicles produced in monasteries favored by the new king emphasized Matilda's rightful claim and noble perseverance. It is no coincidence that many of these institutions received royal grants and lands during Henry's rule. The reinterpretation of Matilda's legacy was thus not only a personal vindication, but also a political necessity for her dynasty. Through her son's patronage, the empress's reputation was repaired, and her story reshaped to serve the narrative of legitimate succession. The connection between queens and chroniclers grew stronger in the centuries that followed. During the later Middle Ages, literacy expanded among the nobility, and written records became instruments of authority. Queens, educated in Latin or French, often took an active interest in books and manuscripts. Some collected illuminated gospels and psalters. Others commissioned translations of saints' lives or histories that reinforced ideals of good governance. In doing so, they controlled the moral framework in which history would be read. For example, Margaret of Anjou, though vilified by Yorkist writers during the Wars of the Roses, attempted to sponsor literary works that portrayed her husband Henry VI as a pious and gentle ruler. Even after her fall, later Tudor chroniclers, eager to trace their own legitimacy, softened their depiction of her, portraying her as a tragic figure caught in the violence of men's ambitions. These reinterpretations were shaped by patterns of royal sponsorship that queens before her had established. Catherine de' Medici, ruling in a later age but facing similar challenges, understood that controlling the written word was as crucial as commanding armies. Her position as a foreign-born queen and regent during the French Wars of Religion made her a target for propaganda. Pamphlets accused her of deceit and witchcraft, reflecting the anxieties of a kingdom divided by faith. To counter this, Catherine cultivated writers and historians who would record her as a guardian of the crown rather than a manipulator of it. She funded translations of political works that justified strong royal authority and encouraged the production of court histories that emphasized loyalty and moderation. Even the architecture and art she sponsored carried written inscriptions and symbols that spoke to her intended image as the protector of France. In an age when printed words could spread quickly, Catherine's awareness of narrative control kept her influence alive despite the hostility of her critics. The relationship between queens and chroniclers was not always direct. Sometimes their influence came through the men who served them, confessors, secretaries, or court scholars. These intermediaries, dependent on royal favor, often shaped their writings to please their patrons. When Elizabeth I of England reigned, she surrounded herself with writers who understood the political value of language. Although not a medieval queen, Elizabeth inherited the traditions of patronage that her foremothers had refined. She commissioned official accounts of her speeches, funded historians such as William Camden, and ensured that records of her reign emphasized divine providence and national unity. Her famous speeches, carefully transcribed and circulated, were both performance and documentation. Through them, she constructed a narrative of herself as the mother of the nation, a theme long prepared by earlier queens who had learned to blend gender, piety, and power in written form. The subtlety of this influence cannot be overstated. Queens rarely dictated to chroniclers directly, yet their patronage determined which voices were heard and which were silenced. A monastery that depended on a queen's protection was unlikely to record her actions unfavorably. Likewise, a chronicler seeking advancement knew the value of aligning his narrative with royal policy. Over time, these choices accumulated into history itself. The portrayal of queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Blanche of Castile as wise and devout rulers owes as much to their sponsorship of religious writing as to their personal virtue. Through carefully managed generosity, they turned the act of donation into the act of remembrance. Queens also influenced the form of chronicles. Many preferred devotional or didactic styles that presented rulers as moral exemplars. This blending of piety and politics allowed them to legitimize their power through faith. For instance, the Life of St. Louis, written under the influence of Blanche's court, was both hagiography and royal propaganda. It linked the Capetian dynasty to divine grace, reinforcing the sacred nature of monarchy. Similarly, chronicles produced under the Angevin kings, descendants of Matilda and Eleanor, emphasized the continuity and divine favor of their line. These works were not neutral records, they were arguments about legitimacy, shaped by those who had the means to commission them. In many cases, queens ensured that their familial connections were memorialized in chronicles, securing the prestige of their lineage. Marriage alliances were recorded in glowing terms, and disputes were softened or omitted. Through selective memory, they protected their families from the harsh judgments of posterity. Even small acts of patronage could have lasting impact. When a queen endowed a monastery and requested prayers for her soul, that request often included the copying of her name and deeds into the community's annals. Over centuries, such entries formed the backbone of medieval historiography, intertwining devotion with documentation. The shaping of royal narratives also involved what might be called editorial influence. While it is unlikely that queens personally revised manuscripts, they could request revisions or suppress unflattering accounts. Copies of chronicles circulated slowly and were often rewritten in new editions. A favorable reinterpretation ordered by a queen could replace an earlier, critical version. This process occurred across generations. A queen might not live to see the final form of her legacy, but her patronage ensured that later historians, writing in institutions she had supported, would treat her memory with respect. The idea of history as a crafted story, rather than an objective record, was well understood in the courts of Europe. Queens recognized that power ended with death, but reputation endured through writing. They sought to shape that afterlife through generosity, persuasion, and sometimes quiet censorship. The presence of their patronage can still be traced in the manuscripts that survive today. Illuminated initials bearing their coats of arms, dedications written in their honor, and prefaces invoking their names all testify to their role as custodians of history. This influence extended beyond the royal court into the broader culture of literacy. Queens who promoted education and supported book production contributed to the spread of knowledge that later empowered writers to record the deeds of others. The tradition of female patronage in literature, begun in the medieval period, continued into the Renaissance and beyond. Every chronicle copied under royal protection carried forward the legacy of queens who valued the written word as a means of authority. The lasting effect of these efforts is visible in how modern historians perceive the Middle Ages. Many of the sources that define our understanding of that era were shaped, directly or indirectly, by queens' patronage. The very narratives that once seemed to exclude women are, upon closer inspection, filled with their influence. The accounts of kings' victories, the moral lessons embedded in chronicles, and even the structure of dynastic histories bear traces of female guidance. The queen's hand, invisible yet enduring, guided the pen that Eleanor of Aquitaine's descendants would later claim her as a paragon of royal virtue, emphasizing her role as mother of kings rather than as rebel consort. This sanitized version of her life, preserved in monastic chronicles and genealogies, reflects the success of her family's control over historical memory. Blanche of Castile's image as a saintly regent owes much to the religious tone of the chronicles written under her patronage. Even Empress Matilda, once vilified as proud and ungovernable, emerged in later accounts as a wronged heir and foundational figure of English monarchy. These transformations show how the past can be rewritten by those who understand the politics of memory. Queens who engaged with chroniclers were not only preserving their own stories, but also defining models of behavior for future rulers. Their portrayal of patience, piety, and justice became templates for later monarchs, both male and female. Through their patronage, they taught that authority could be moral as well as political, that power required both intellect and restraint. Their narratives, crafted with care, outlived the turbulence of their reigns. The preservation of royal chronicles was itself an act of control. Many manuscripts were stored in royal or monastic libraries under the protection of the crown. Queens ensured that these collections remained intact, sometimes expanding them through gifts and commissions. By safeguarding the written record, they safeguarded the legitimacy of their line. This understanding of history as inheritance reveals a deeper dimension of queenship. They did not merely influence events in their own lifetimes. They planned for the memory of their rule to sustain the authority of those who followed. In the long span of history, the pens they funded proved mightier than the crowns they wore. The queens who supported chroniclers shaped not only how their contemporaries viewed them, but how centuries of historians would interpret their time. Their patronage demonstrates that political mastery extended beyond the visible acts of rule into the creation of culture and memory. The monasteries they endowed became the archives of nations, the scribes they paid became the first historians, and the narratives they inspired became the foundation of historical thought. To look beyond the king's shadow, one must also look into the pages of the chronicles that survive. There, in the illuminated margins and careful prose, one can still see the subtle imprint of queens who understood that words could outlast empires. Their influence was not limited to their lifetimes, but written into the very structure of history. Through faith, foresight, and the calculated use of patronage, they became guardians of their own stories and of the stories of their realms. Their legacy reminds us that history is never neutral. It is a conversation between those who lived it and those who chose to record it. The queens who shaped that conversation ensured that their voices, once constrained by custom, would continue to speak through the centuries. The influence of queens did not end with politics, patronage, or the written word. Their presence continued to shape the physical and cultural landscape of the medieval and early modern world. The stones of abbeys, castles, and cathedrals still carry traces of their ambition, and the traditions of art and literature that flourished in their courts reveal a legacy as enduring as any dynasty. While kings often built fortresses for defense or palaces for power, queens built spaces that expressed faith, memory, and refinement. Through architecture, they made statements about identity and authority that could outlast their reigns. Through art and culture, they molded ideals of beauty, virtue, and love that would influence generations. The story of queenship, therefore, is not confined to the chronicles of wars and treaties, but continues in the monuments and cultural movements they inspired. Eleanor of Aquitaine once again stands at the center of this transformation. Her influence on European culture reached far beyond the boundaries of her kingdoms. The courts she presided over became centers of artistic expression, where poets, troubadours, and musicians found inspiration in her patronage. The ideals of courtly love, which celebrated loyalty, chivalry, and the moral education of knights through admiration of noble women, took root under her protection. These songs and poems were not mere diversions. They shaped social conduct and moral expectations across Christendom. Through literature, Eleanor and her contemporaries cultivated an image of the court as a place of refinement and learning rather than just a seat of power. The culture of chivalry that developed from these traditions would later influence the behavior of knights and rulers across Europe, embedding in them the idea that strength must be tempered by honor and courtesy. Eleanor's impact was also visible in stone. She and her husband, Henry of Anjou, were responsible for major building projects across their vast empire. Yet Eleanor's personal legacy is most strongly tied to religious architecture. After her turbulent political life, she retired to the Abbey of Fontevraud, a monastery she had long supported. It was a rare institution that housed both monks and nuns under the authority of an abbess, symbolizing balance and unity, principles Eleanor herself embodied. At Fontevraud, she commissioned works of art and ensured the abbey's role as a royal burial site. Her tomb, placed beside those of Henry and her son Richard, depicts her not in deathly repose, but reading a book, a rare and powerful image of a queen's intellect. The sculpture captures how Eleanor wished to be remembered, as a patron of wisdom, culture, and enduring faith. Through this act of architectural and artistic patronage, she inscribed her story into the very stones of history. Empress Matilda's legacy, though less visible in surviving monuments, also left an imprint on the architectural and administrative structures of her time. Her support for religious foundations in Normandy and England reflected her understanding that spiritual and political authority were intertwined. The abbeys she endowed served as centers of loyalty, linking piety with governance. Even as her struggle for the throne consumed much of her life, she ensured that her family's memory would endure through sacred architecture. Her son Henry later expanded on these foundations, continuing her practice of royal patronage of the church. In this way, Matilda's influence extended into the very fabric of the realm, shaping how the monarchy expressed devotion and legitimacy through stone. Blanche of Castile continued this tradition on a grander scale. As regent and later as queen mother, she undertook a series of architectural and cultural projects that reflected both her piety and her political wisdom. One of her most significant contributions was her patronage of the Abbey of Maubuisson, located near Paris. This Cistercian house, founded at her expense, became a resting place for members of the royal family. The simplicity and harmony of its architecture mirrored the ideals of the Cistercian order, spiritual purity and moral order, qualities Blanche sought to project in her own governance. By creating such spaces, she linked her family's image to the sacred, reinforcing the idea that Capetian rule was divinely ordained. Blanche also supported the construction of the great Gothic cathedrals that rose across France during her lifetime. The rebuilding of Notre Dame in Paris and the completion of Chartres Cathedral were projects closely tied to the royal court's patronage. The art and architecture of these cathedrals expressed the unity of faith and monarchy. Their soaring spires and stained-glass windows spoke of divine light and royal glory, while inscriptions and iconography often included references to the reigning family. Blanche's devotion to the Virgin Mary shaped the iconographic programs of these cathedrals, where queens were often represented as protectors and intercessors, parallel to the Holy Mother herself. The tradition of queens as builders was not limited to France or England. Across Europe, royal women left physical marks of their power and faith. Isabella of Castile, ruling centuries later, combined her political ambition with an architectural vision that sought to represent the unity of her realm. She and her husband Ferdinand initiated vast building projects, from palaces and universities to churches and fortifications. The completion of the Granada Cathedral and the construction of royal chapels in cities such as Toledo and Seville symbolized the triumph of Christian rule after centuries of conflict. These projects, while often remembered as national achievements, were deeply connected to Isabella's sense of divine mission. Architecture became an expression of both sovereignty and salvation, embodying her vision of a united, pious kingdom. Queens used architecture not only to express faith, but also to shape political identity. Buildings served as symbols of legitimacy, continuity, and control. A well-placed abbey could secure loyalty in a contested region, just as a magnificent palace could project stability. Queens often oversaw the design, financing, and even decoration of such sites. Their involvement demonstrated competence in administration as well as taste in art. Catherine de' Medici, for example, left her mark on France through her construction of the Tuileries Palace and her influence on the gardens of the Louvre. Though she ruled in a time of religious conflict, she envisioned her architectural projects as symbols of peace and magnificence. The design of her palaces incorporated Italian artistic sensibilities, blending elegance with authority. Through these spaces, Catherine cultivated an image of the French court as a place of sophistication and learning, countering the violence that threatened to define her era. The artistic and cultural impact of queens extended beyond architecture into every realm of creative expression. They were patrons of painters, sculptors, musicians, and poets. Through their commissions, they directed the themes and styles that would dominate their courts and influence Europe for centuries. Eleanor of Aquitaine's support for troubadour poetry created a literary movement that shaped not only French, but also English and Italian traditions. The ideals of honor and romance found in her courts later inspired works such as the Tales of King Arthur and the Legends of the Round Table. These stories, which linked chivalry to moral virtue, owe much to the cultural vision of a queen who saw refinement as a form of governance. Blanche of Castile also encouraged the production of manuscripts and religious art. The illuminated Bible of St. Louis, commissioned under her supervision, remains one of the most exquisite artifacts of medieval France. Its detailed miniatures and lavish design combined theological instruction with royal symbolism. Each image served as both devotion and propaganda, presenting the young king as a ruler guided by divine wisdom and maternal counsel. Blanche's careful direction ensured that the book would reflect the unity of faith and monarchy, demonstrating how culture could be a tool of governance as much as architecture or law. In England, queens such as Eleanor of Provence and Philippa of Hainaut continued this legacy, fostering courtly culture and the arts. Eleanor brought with her a taste for continental style and refinement, introducing new fashions, music, and literature to the English court. Philippa, wife of Edward III, became a patron of chroniclers and poets, most notably Geoffrey Chaucer in the following generation. Under her influence, the English court developed a reputation for artistic innovation and moral virtue. The Order of the Garter, founded during her husband's reign, was steeped in the ideals of chivalry and honor that had long been cultivated by queens before her. Though she did not design the order herself, Philippa's presence at court shaped its moral tone and ceremonial grace. The queen's patronage of art and architecture often worked hand in hand to communicate moral and political messages. Their building projects were frequently accompanied by artistic programs that celebrated royal virtues and dynastic continuity. Frescoes, sculptures, and stained glass depicted scenes from scripture that paralleled the lives of the royal family. These visual narratives taught subjects to associate monarchy with divine order and justice. Queens, often represented in these artworks as mediators or intercessors, embodied compassion and piety. In this way, they humanized the image of the crown while reinforcing its sanctity. Queens also influenced fashion and courtly etiquette, setting trends that radiated through every level of society. Their choices in clothing, jewelry, and ceremony became statements of identity and control. A queen's attire was not mere ornament, but a language of power. Rich fabrics and intricate designs reflected wealth and taste, while modesty in dress could project piety and virtue. The balance between magnificence and humility was carefully maintained to convey authority without arrogance. Through such visual signals, queens shaped the culture of their courts and, by extension, the ideals of femininity and nobility throughout Europe. The architectural and cultural legacy of queens transcended their own time because it addressed both the spiritual and the social dimensions of life. The abbeys they founded became centers of learning and charity. The cathedrals they adorned became symbols of communal identity. Their patronage of literature and art cultivated values that guided conduct and morality. Even in periods of political decline, their cultural influence endured. Long after the Plantagenets and Capetians had faded from power, the ideals of chivalry, devotion, and courtly grace continued to define European civilization. The importance of these contributions lies not only in the beauty of what was built or written, but in the continuity they provided. Queens often ruled during times of transition, between dynasties, between war and peace, between medieval tradition and modern statecraft. Their projects anchored society in moments of uncertainty, giving form to faith and order. A cathedral rising above a city, a poem sung in a noble hall, or a tapestry depicting a queen's virtues, all served to remind subjects of stability and purpose. In this sense, queens acted as custodians of collective memory, turning art and architecture into instruments of cohesion. Some queens used culture to reconcile divided realms. Isabella of Castile's sponsorship of religious and educational institutions sought to unify a newly conquered and diverse Spain. Catherine de' Medici's art and festivals were designed to bridge the gap between Catholics and Protestants. Even in their failures, these attempts reveal how deeply queens believed in the power of culture to heal division. They understood that architecture and art could reach hearts where laws and decrees could not. Their palaces and cathedrals became stages upon which the drama of reconciliation played out, where beauty became an argument for peace. The connection between queenship and creativity reflects a broader truth about the nature of power. Authority in the medieval world was not only asserted through conquest or governance, but also through representation. The queen's ability to shape the symbols of her era gave her influence that often exceeded her formal role. The values of chivalry, the aesthetic of Gothic architecture, the refinement of courtly manners, all these elements, often attributed to the age itself, were in many ways the result of queens' deliberate cultivation. Their vision of order and grace transformed rough feudal structures into a culture that prized intellect and virtue alongside might. Even today, the remnants of their works remind us of their presence. The carved figures on cathedral portals, the stained glass that filters sunlight through colors of royal heraldry, the ruins of monasteries that once echoed with prayer, all speak of queens who understood that beauty could be a form of governance. Through these enduring monuments, they continue to participate in the life of history, shaping how we imagine the past. The legacy of queens in stone and story reveals that their reigns were not confined to the narrow boundaries of their lifetimes. They built worlds that lasted beyond their names, worlds of architecture, art, and belief. Their influence extended from the walls of abbeys to the verses of poets, from the fashion of the court to the conscience of a nation. In doing so, they transformed queenship from a position of dependency into a force of creation. The castles they commissioned guarded more than lands. They guarded the idea of civilization itself. The cathedrals they inspired lifted human vision toward the divine, and the culture they fostered softened the brutal edge of power with the grace of meaning. Their enduring influence reminds us that history is as much about creation as it is about conquest. The queens who built, wrote, and inspired did more than survive within systems of male authority. They redefined them. Their works, carved in stone and sung in story, continue to speak of a time when power and beauty were intertwined, and when women, through wisdom and imagination, shaped the very foundations of culture. To look upon the cathedrals they blessed, the manuscripts they commissioned, and the ideals they nurtured is to see the living proof that their reigns were never confined to shadow. Through stone, song, and story, they remain the architects of history's most enduring light. The memory of these queens did not disappear entirely after their deaths, but their stories were reshaped, simplified, or forgotten through centuries of male-centered history. Their names survived in chronicles, yet the depth of their achievements was often dulled by prejudice. They became symbols rather than subjects, their strength reduced to anecdotes or moral lessons. For a long time, they existed as supporting characters in tales dominated by kings, generals, and saints. The stone monuments they commissioned remained, their beauty undiminished, but the minds behind them were rarely acknowledged. The women who had built kingdoms, guided dynasties, and shaped the culture of Europe were left in the margins of history books, visible only to those who knew where to look. It was only much later, as historians began to question traditional narratives, that these forgotten figures began to re-emerge. The modern era, with its hunger for more complete stories, turned its gaze to the past and found within it the voices of queens who had never truly been silent. Scholars started to read charters, letters, and chronicles with a new awareness, asking not only what events took place, but who influenced them and why certain people were written out. When viewed through this lens, the queens who once seemed peripheral became central once more. Their influence, long obscured by the language of kingship, revealed itself in the structures they built, the art they sponsored, and the decisions that changed nations. Eleanor of Aquitaine, once depicted as a romantic and rebellious figure, is now recognized as one of the most politically astute leaders of her age. Modern historians no longer see her as merely the wife of two kings, but as a strategist who united and managed vast territories. Her ability to navigate political crisis, to survive imprisonment, and to rule in her son's absence marks her as a formidable stateswoman. The letters she left behind show her command of diplomacy, and the culture she fostered reflects her intelligence and sense of purpose. Contemporary analysis portrays her not as a woman who defied the norms of her time for the sake of rebellion, but as one who understood power in its most complex form and used it to ensure stability and legacy. Similarly, the study of Empress Matilda has undergone a profound transformation. For generations, chroniclers described her as proud and arrogant, a woman whose refusal to submit was treated as a flaw rather than a virtue. Yet recent scholarship reveals that such criticism came from male writers who could not accept a woman claiming the right to rule in her own name. Today she is recognized as a pioneer who paved the way for future generations of royal women. Her courage in asserting her legitimacy against overwhelming opposition challenged the assumptions of her age and redefined the boundaries of authority. By examining her through the records she created rather than through the insults of her enemies, historians have uncovered a leader of vision, endurance, and principle. Blanche of Castile, too, has benefited from this renewed attention. Once remembered mainly as the mother of St. Louis, she is now acknowledged as the architect of his reign. Her regency, once treated as a brief interlude, is now seen as one of the most successful in medieval Europe. She ruled with balance, combining strength with restraint, and left a model of queenship grounded in intellect and discipline. Her policies of justice, her support for education, and her moral guidance shaped the character of the kingdom she protected. Modern historians view her not as a caretaker, but as a ruler in her own right, one whose influence extended long after her death. This broader reassessment has extended to many other royal women across history. Isabella of France, once maligned as the she-wolf of England, is now studied as a politically intelligent queen navigating an impossible situation. Margaret of Anjou, long blamed for the violence of the Wars of the Roses, is re-examined as a woman fighting for her family's survival in an age when power could be claimed only through men. Catherine de' Medici, once portrayed as a manipulative schemer, is now appreciated as a shrewd diplomat who preserved France through decades of religious war. Even Isabella of Castile, often remembered solely for her association with conquest and exploration, is being reconsidered in light of her administrative and educational reforms. Each of these women, when freed from centuries of prejudice, emerges as a full and complex figure, defined by intelligence, conviction, and humanity. The resurgence of interest in these queens is part of a larger movement to recover the voices of women across history. It reflects a growing understanding that the past cannot be truly known if half of it remains unseen. The work of historians, archaeologists, and literary scholars has opened new ways of reading old sources. Letters once dismissed as domestic correspondence are now recognized as political documents. Architectural patronage once attributed to kings is being correctly reassigned to the queens who financed and designed it. Manuscripts and chronicles are being studied not only for what they say, but for what they omit. In many cases, the silences of history speak as loudly as its words, and it is in those silences that the presence of queens can be felt most clearly. The modern reevaluation of queenship also challenges assumptions about leadership itself. For centuries, power was defined in masculine terms: military success, territorial expansion, and personal command. The queens of medieval and early modern Europe often operated outside that framework, ruling through persuasion, negotiation, and endurance. Their success depended on subtlety rather than force, on the ability to balance relationships and to foresee consequences. In a modern context, this kind of leadership resonates deeply. It speaks to the idea that authority does not have to be loud to be strong, that influence can work through patience as effectively as through conquest. Understanding these women is not just an act of justice to the past. It also reshapes how we think about the present. The rediscovery of queens such as Eleanor, Matilda, and Blanche offers a richer picture of how power actually functions. It reveals that leadership, whether in a court, a government, or a community, depends on vision, adaptability, and emotional intelligence. These were qualities that queens cultivated not out of luxury, but out of necessity. They were often forced to wield power in societies that denied them formal authority. Their creativity in doing so, through diplomacy, culture, and religion, demonstrates a form of resilience that remains relevant today. The renewed focus on queenship also helps to balance the narrative of European history, which has long celebrated the deeds of kings and warriors while overlooking those who built peace, culture, and continuity. The stability of kingdoms often depended on the wisdom of queens who mediated disputes, arranged alliances, and preserved dynasties. Their influence extended through generations, shaping not only their own reigns but the political and moral values that followed. When historians bring these women back into focus, they restore the completeness of the human story, showing that the making of history was always a shared endeavor. The interest in queens has spread beyond academic circles into popular culture. Historical novels, documentaries, and films have introduced figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Catherine de' Medici to new audiences. Museums and heritage sites now highlight the contributions of queens to art, architecture, and politics. The tombs of royal women, once overshadowed by those of their husbands, are visited with renewed respect. The Abbey of Fontevraud, where Eleanor rests, has become not just a monument to a dynasty, but a symbol of female intellect and endurance. In France, exhibitions devoted to Blanche of Castile and Catherine de' Medici draw crowds eager to see how these women shaped the nation's history. The rediscovery of their stories has become a cultural movement in itself, connecting modern audiences with the human experiences that lie behind medieval walls and manuscripts. The importance of this movement lies in more than curiosity. It lies in what it teaches about the nature of history. The past is not fixed. It changes as our understanding deepens. For centuries, the narrative of monarchy was told through male voices because they were the ones who held the pen or commissioned the chronicle. Today, as those same records are read differently, the women who lived and acted within them are finally being heard. This process of reclamation is not about rewriting history to favor one gender over another. It is about restoring balance and recognizing that the truth of the past is always more complex than its first telling. The effort to reclaim the narratives of queens also helps challenge broader stereotypes about gender and leadership. In the stories of Eleanor, Matilda, and Blanche, one sees examples of strategic thinking, moral courage, and cultural vision that defy the idea that women in the past were passive or powerless. These queens confronted the same political dangers as men and did so with tools that required intellect and emotional insight rather than brute strength. Their achievements remind modern readers that leadership comes in many forms and that it often arises in unexpected places. Reclaiming their narrative is also an act of continuity. The ideals that queens promoted, justice, mercy, learning, and cultural refinement, remain at the heart of human civilization. The cathedrals they built still draw visitors seeking beauty and meaning. The poetry they inspired still echoes in the language of love and honor. The example they set, of balancing duty with compassion and power with grace, continues to inspire reflection on what it means to govern well. When modern historians and readers rediscover their lives, they reconnect with these enduring principles. The renewed attention to queens has also encouraged a more inclusive approach to historical study. Researchers now explore not only the actions of famous monarchs, but also the experiences of lesser-known women who served as regents, diplomats, or cultural patrons. The web of female influence that once sustained courts and kingdoms is gradually coming into view. It reveals that queenship was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a broader network of women whose labor and intellect sustained the political and cultural life of Europe. By reclaiming their stories, scholars show that history is richer and more interconnected than once believed. The act of revisiting their lives also raises important questions about how memory works. Why were these women forgotten? What does it say about the societies that preserved the deeds of kings but neglected those of queens? The answers lie partly in the biases of chroniclers and partly in the broader structure of historical transmission. Power, for centuries, was narrated in masculine terms. Yet the rediscovery of queens shows that the foundations of civilization were built by both sexes, even if only one was credited. To study them now is to acknowledge that omission and to correct it, not through sentimentality, but through evidence and understanding. In the modern world, where the role of women in leadership continues to evolve, the stories of these queens offer a deep and enduring lesson. They remind us that strength does not depend on force, that influence can be both subtle and transformative, and that endurance is itself a form of power. By learning how these women navigated systems designed to exclude them, one gains insight into how barriers of all kinds can be challenged through intelligence and integrity. Their experiences transcend their time, offering guidance for anyone who seeks to lead with vision and compassion in a complex world. The call to action, then, is simple but vital: to continue seeking out these stories, to read the sources with fresh eyes, and to share the truths they contain. The recovery of Queen's Histories is not an academic exercise alone, but a human one. It connects us to the lives of people who face the same fears and hopes that define our own existence. It expands the story of humanity to include those who were long kept in shadow. Each rediscovered letter, each restored monument, each new interpretation of an old chronicle brings us closer to understanding not only the past but ourselves. To engage with the lives of queens such as Eleanor of Aquitaine, Empress Matilda, and Blanche of Castile is to rediscover the power of endurance and imagination. Their legacies in politics, architecture, and culture show that influence need not depend on title or tradition, but on the courage to act and the wisdom to build. As modern historians, writers, and readers continue to explore their stories, they keep alive the light that these women brought into their worlds. In doing so, they help us see history not as a tale of kings alone, but as the shared creation of men and women whose partnership shaped civilization. The queens who once lived beyond the king's shadow now stand in their own right, their voices resonating through the centuries. Their castles may have weathered and their courts may have vanished, but the ideas they nurtured, justice, learning, and grace, endure. The task of reclaiming their narrative is not only about giving them their due, but about completing the story of humanity itself. To study them is to understand that history, like the societies it records, is strongest when it remembers all who built it.